Good morning. Our gospel reading is Luke's Gospel, chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. Jesus entered Jericho and made his way through the town. There was a man there named Zacchaeus. He was the chief tax collector in the region, and he had become very rich. He tried to get a look at Jesus, but he was too short to see over the crowd. So he ran ahead, climbed a sycamore tree beside the road, for Jesus was going to pass that way. When Jesus came by, he looked up at Zacchaeus and called him by name. "Zacchaeus," he said, "quick, come down from that tree, because I want to be a guest in your home today." Zacchaeus quickly climbed down and took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. But the people were displeased. He had gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner, they grumbled. Meanwhile, Zacchaeus stood before the Lord and said, "I will give half my wealth to the poor, Lord, and if I've cheated people on their taxes, I will give them back 4 times as much." Jesus responded, "Salvation has come to this home today, for this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save those who were lost." May Christ add this blessing to us today through the reading of this word. Well, the title for my message this morning is "The Way to Happy." Asking you the question, what is the way to happiness? How do you find the way to happy? And this I know to be true, is that happiness, true happiness, a sense of joy that comes from the inside out, a sense of well-being, is not based on our external circumstances. External circumstances like our possessions, our power, our influence, our social validation, or even our health. Because I've known people who've had all those things, who've had health and wealth and social validation, who've had power and influence, but who were some of the most miserable and unhappy people that I've ever met. At the same time, I have known people who've had very little. People who have had challenging circumstances in their health. People who have struggled with adversity throughout their life. And yet when you look at them, you see a peace that transcends understanding, that comes from somewhere inside of them. You see, happiness, I believe, is something that everyone desires. Raise your hand if you want to be unhappy. We all want to be happy for the most part. Because every now and then you do run into someone who's only happy if they're unhappy, who seem to be able to find contentment in their negativity, who seem to derive pleasure from their misery, who seem to be one of those individuals who is always looking for fault and finding a dark cloud behind, every rainbow. Negative, pessimistic, unhappy, miserable people. Consider Sarah, or it could be Sally or Jim or Bob or anything, but consider Sarah. Sarah is one of those individuals that's fixated on people's faults and what's wrong and what's broken and what's unfair. For instance, for Sally, she may be taking a walk one day through the gathering place on a beautiful sunny day, and even on a sunny day in a beautiful park, she'll say, "It's too hot," or "These mosquitoes," or "Don't they pull those weeds?" Or Sally gets a promotion at work and she gets a higher salary, gets a promotion, elevated to a new status. And very quickly, Sally begins to complain about her coworkers or her new level of responsibility. She's one of these people who seems to derive some kind of pleasure from drama. You don't know anybody like that, do you? Of course not. We know it. None of us do. And the reality is there are some people that way who are only happy when they're unhappy. And it's also true of religion. Sometime in some faith communities, people are taught that the way to happy is by looking at your faults, by looking at yourself through a lens of constant self-deprecation and criticism. Sometimes churches will call it total depravity, perhaps. But you know, you go to church on a Sunday morning and the purpose of the sermon is to make you feel bad about yourself. And it's a good Sunday if you will feel self-loathing when you leave worship. There are some communities that are like that. But what I've learned through life is this about happiness is that happiness is a way. It's something that we find on a path. Happiness is not a destination. It's not something that you pursue. In fact, if you pursue happiness, you won't find it. You won't receive it. That true happiness and joy that's inside of us, that comes out of us, is something that happens and we find and we experience while we're pursuing other things. It's a byproduct of other pursuits. And this is what I've discovered, is that the way to happy is this dynamic synergy that takes place between gratitude and generosity. That the way to happy is this synergy that occurs when these two things come together in our life, when we're grateful, and that gratefulness leads to a generous, giving life. Last Thursday, I had a wonderful day. I drove down to Little Rock and spent the day with some former church members. I was asked to come down and had the honor of presiding over the funeral of a wonderful woman named Marlene Williams. 34 years ago, I was called to be the pastor at Parkview Christian Church. I was 27 years old. Do the math. It was a long time ago. 2 years out of seminary, and this congregation of 35 to 40 people called a minister who was very energetic and very ADHD. If you think I have activity today and I'm energetic today, you should have known me at 27. And Marlene Williams was the chairperson of the board. Marlene was a CPA and she was still a lot of fun. She was firm, but she was fun, and she was the perfect leader for me. And this is what I appreciated about her, is that she knew how to rein me in without dampening my spirit. She could see that my enthusiasm and my energy was a good thing, and so she learned to work with it. And when her son called me and said, "David, would you come back and do my mom's funeral for me?" I had to go. I had to go and express my gratitude to her because at a very formative period in my life, she helped shape me as a minister, and I love her for that, and I'm grateful for that. That little congregation had every reason to close up and abandon ship. We were a church in a very troubled neighborhood with lots of substance abuse and lots of crime. But instead of abandoning ship through her leadership and through the work of that church, they opened their doors and opened their hearts. And as a result, over a 5-year period, this church of 25 or 30 in worship grew to about 100 in worship. And we began to gather some of the most unusual, interesting people you would ever see gathered in one room together to praise God. And what I loved so much about that church was that church understood something about following Jesus. That the best way to follow Jesus in the world is to follow Jesus with a grateful and generous and giving heart. And because they were this congregation that was just grateful for God's blessings, and because they were generous with themselves and their lives, that church was infectious and made a pretty significant impact on that congregation. Last week, I also had the opportunity to talk to a friend of mine named James, who moved from Salem, Oregon, to serving a church in Maryland. And he was telling me about his new church. And he was saying, David, I'm concerned because, well, we don't have a good website. We don't have screens and technology. You know, we're not able to film the service. We don't have a nice sign in front of the building. And he was talking about it. And I said, James, those are great tools. But I said, it doesn't matter if you have a good sign or a good website if you don't have a heart. I said, in today's world, there's something more important than the externals. It's what's internal. It's what you have in the heart, because people today in the world are searching for something authentic and real, and what they're looking for are grateful and generous people. I said, if you have that, you don't need a screen. It'll help, but you don't need it, because you'll have what's inside you. Because generosity and gratitude are a potent force in a congregation's life and in our lives that are attractive and infectious and are the way to happy. I've never met a grateful person and a generous person who was unhappy. Gratitude, simply defined, is the art or the ability to look around you and to see the good and to give appreciation for it and to express our thanks. Generosity, on the other hand, is like breathing out. Gratitude is like breathing in, and generosity is like breathing out. It's an act of selflessness where we're looking for opportunities to share blessings and to improve the lives of other people. That's what gratitude is at its heart. And they are a potent force when they come together in our life or in our world. That's what I love about this story from Luke chapter 19. Now, that story is probably familiar to you. The story of the tax collector in the top of the tree. But for us in this century, that story has lost some of its shock value. Because in the first century, it was shocking and startling. Because tax collectors were despised. Tax collectors cooperated with the dreaded and fearful Roman Empire. And the way you become a tax collector is you would make a bid. From this particular region, I can collect this amount of taxes. And everything you collected over and above your bid is what would be your pay. And so if a tax collector became rich collecting taxes, it meant that he was gouging his people. They already disliked him enough because they were cooperating with Rome, but they liked him even less because they were gaming the system and taking advantage of them and driving a poor people even deeper into their deprivation. And so this tax collector, hear that Jesus is coming through the town. And wherever Jesus went, it was a spectacle. And so as Jesus is passing through the town and the crowds are gathering around of curious people and followers, he climbs up into the top of a tree to see what all this fuss is about. And then Jesus does this remarkable thing. What Jesus always does. Jesus has a way of seeing that one person in the crowd with the need. He can see people's hearts. And he looks up and he sees Zacchaeus and says, Zacchaeus, come down from that tree, because I'm going to your home today to share a meal with you. And the text says it shocked the crowd because they hated tax collectors. And not only was he a tax collector, but he was really good at it. He was the chief tax collector, meaning he excelled at defrauding others. And so here was Jesus sitting in the home of this tax collector, and something began to move in his heart and his spirit. You see, for Jesus didn't necessarily challenge institutions. Jesus challenged people. Challenged people's hearts, and the transformation of people's hearts lead to the transformation of the world around us. And so, witnessing Jesus' love and kindness and compassion filled with gratitude, a transformation takes place in this man's life. It's a conversion moment. He stands up and filled with gratitude for Jesus and says, because of who you are and what you've meant to me and what I see in you, I'm going to give half my money to the poor. And I'm going to refund those I've defrauded 4 times. And then Jesus says these words. Jesus says, Salvation has come to this house today, for he true too is a son of Abraham. Now notice this. There's no confession of faith in this text. He doesn't say, I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and I believe this, and this. No. The salvation he's referring to, he's talking about wholeness and abundance, comes when this man expresses gratitude and it flows out in generosity. And Jesus said, I came to seek those who are lost and to find them. And let me just say this, we got a whole bunch of people lost in the world that we're living in, stuck in some patterns of negativity and consumerism. And the path forward for us is to see how God loves us and to respond with gratitude, to be grateful for what God has done, to be grateful for our lives, and to respond to the world with this abundant mindset and with generosity. What's really interesting is when you read through Luke's gospel, you'll see that on every single page, in every single chapter, Jesus does talk about wealth and possessions. And he does talk about gratitude. And the reason for that is that Jesus knew something to be true. That wealth and possessions do not always equate with happiness. And that wealth and possessions can become a barrier to happiness. In fact, in this particular story with Zacchaeus the tax collector, right before this story is the story of a wealthy man who has everything he needs, and he's a religious man, yet he can't let go of the grip of his materialism to follow Jesus. And then immediately after the story, Jesus tells a story about a parable about what we do with our possessions and how we invest them, and do we invest them wisely in the work that God does? Do we see our stuff as God's blessings? And then right in the middle is the story of the tax collector who gets it right. Gratitude and generosity. You know, have you heard of the social psychologist Adam Grant? Kevin talked about him a couple weeks ago. He wrote a book, and it's called Give or Take. He's an organizational psychologist who writes about the workplace. Author, podcaster, brilliant, genius man. He said there are 3 types of people in the world. There are givers. And it means just what it means. It means they are people who are looking for reasons to give, and even when there's not a reason to give, they just still give. They're selfless people who give without expecting anything in return. He said, then there are takers. And he said, you know what a taker is, because we've all seen one and we've all probably been one. We're looking out for our own benefit, for what we can gain. Sometimes even in giving, perhaps we're looking for what we are gained. Takers are people who in the workplace or in our families or in the church or in the world are people who are interested in what they can get for themselves. They're not really concerned about others. But there's a third group of people, matchers. You know what a matcher is? A matcher is a person who responds in kind to another person. So you're generous to me, I'll be generous to you. Quid pro quo. In other words, you're kind to me and I will match your generosity with my generosity. Now, does that make sense? Do you get it? You know what a matcher is? You get it? Raise your hand. I'm still here. Yes, I'm listening. Okay. 30,000 people were surveyed. And he said, the majority of the people that were surveyed are matchers. Now, do you remember in that same sermon where Kevin talked about Adam Grant, he talked about this Starbucks chain where there were 378 people who passed through the Starbucks line where one person bought the coffee of the person, a pay-it-forward scenario. This person buys the coffee for the person behind. They buy the person coffee for the person behind. It goes on and on and on for 378 cars. Beautiful story of generosity. Well, wouldn't you know it, last week, I was driving through the drive-thru at Starbucks right around the corner from the church. I pull into the window, and the woman at the window says, oh, the person in front of you bought your coffee. I thought, oh, nice, I'm going to get to live this story. Kevin just told you, I was excited about it. And I said, well, I'm going to pay for the coffee behind me. And then she says, that'll be $13.50, please. And I honestly turned around and went, who spends $13.50 at Starbucks? I mean, And then I drove off and I'm thinking, this is like the most expensive cup of coffee I've ever owned. And and to be honest, in that moment, it was revealing of my character. Because if you're just buying a cup of coffee for the person behind you, for the person that bought it in front of you, that's not generosity. Because it's generosity it's not generosity if it doesn't cost you something. It's just matching. And I was a matcher, not a giver. But it's givers that change the world. So here's the beautiful thing about this gospel story, the way of Jesus. So when you read the Gospels, you see that Jesus invited zealots to be a part of his community. Zealots were those who believed in the violent and believed in using violent means to overthrow the cursed Roman Empire. They were willing to kill in order to gain control and to throw out the Romans. And Jesus invited zealots to be a part of his community. Well, he also invited tax collectors who were exactly the opposite. Instead of trying to overthrow the Romans, they chose to game the system, to benefit from it. Now, these two groups of people became followers of Jesus, zealots and tax collectors. And when you get to the book of Acts, this powerful thing happens. This community, it says that Peter preaches a sermon, and 3,000 people are baptized and join the community. And then you get this amazing description of what the community was like. They were devoted to the apostles' teaching, to prayer, to the breaking of bread, and then this one line. They ate together with one another in each other's homes with grateful and generous hearts. Oh, that's just so good, isn't it? Because you see, gratitude and generosity, the way to happy, is more than a Sunday. It's more than just dropping a tithe in the offering. It's more than filling out a commitment card. It's more than showing up at the Thanksgiving dinner and giving thanks once a year. It's more than one day a week. It's a whole way of living in the world. It's a mindset of the mind and the heart that leads to our transformation and impacts communities. It says because of the way they lived, because they lived with glad and generous hearts in that story, it says that thousands upon thousands were added to the church daily who were being saved. So you want to know the way to be happy? The way to joy? Don't go looking for it. Instead, just choose this potent synergy of gratitude and generosity. That's the way to happy.